Greetings, listeners, and welcome to the fourth installment of the Surviving Satchidananda podcast. This is the show that pulls back the curtain on Satchidananda Ashram Yogaville and integral yoga. They say that they're all about love and light, but as we've figured out these past 3 episodes, where there is light, there are always shadows. I am thrilled today to introduce you to our next guest. We have none other than Carol Murchison. Carol is the head of the Sexual Misconduct and Spiritual Communities practice at McAllister and Oliverius. And this law firm, McAllister and Oliverius, is the firm that is taking on Yogaville and integral yoga in their ongoing litigation that has been brought forward by Shanti Norris and Susan Cohen. These were former secretaries of Swami Satchidananda, and they have bravely come forward telling their story about how Swami Satchidananda sexually abused them. And Carol is the head of the team on the law firm that is taking on this challenge. Carol has been called the cult assassin, the Wonder Woman of taking down cults, and one of the United States' most feared legal eagles. At first, I found that last quote funny, because in all of my conversations with her, she's just been so bright and warm and pleasant to talk to. How could anybody be afraid of this woman? But I bet the cults and high-demand spiritual organizations that she is taking on are afraid of her, because when they see her name on the papers that they are served, they know they are about to be held accountable, and they do not like that. Carol has recently been mentioned in the New York Times because her team is representing former Shenyun dancers in a federal lawsuit that alleges child labor and abuse. She's also been quoted in a report on the Harvard Divinity School conference, and she came out of retirement to do this really important work of taking on spiritual communities that perpetrate abuse. This is a very enlightening and enriching conversation that actually gave me a little bit of hope for the future, which is kind of hard to have these days, if I'm being honest. I hope you enjoy this next episode with Carol. Carol, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really happy to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You are the head of Sexual Misconduct and Spiritual Communities practice at your firm.
Yes.
And I'm interested, how long have you been taking on these types of cases?
Well, that's an interesting question. I started in about 2018, and at the time I was retired, so I was no longer, doing lawyer kind of work. I had been doing investigations for a long time, and I got involved in doing an investigation of a Buddhist community where a woman was saying that many of the community members had been sexually assaulted. And so since I had been doing investigations, I volunteered to do that, and it turned out that that was true. I was very surprised. It was not my idea of what a Buddhist leader would be doing, but because that particular case got a lot of publicity, then all of a sudden other women started coming forward and saying, wait a minute, that happened to me in this other community over here. And then others saying the same thing. I didn't know that this was actually a thing. And so I began doing other investigations until about 2021 when I joined the law firm McAllister Oliverius, which has a long history of litigating for women's rights and in the workplace and in other places. And so we decided to have a group that's solely dedicated to spiritual communities.
That's almost sad that there needs to be a whole department in a firm, but that's not the only one. There's tons of these.
Yes,
there
are.
That take these cases, and
yes, it is sad,
disturbing.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
it is. Because I think that, when we think of, or at least when I think of spiritual community, I think of what people are really looking for. They are seekers. They are people who want to be better. They want to build a better world. They have all kinds of ideals. And when these sexual assaults happen, it's very disturbing. Of course, any sexual assault is. But the context of this one being very different, I think is very confusing to a lot of people. I think for a lot of people for whom this happens, it is first confusing because it happens with a person that you look up to, that you've been told is a leader and is a spiritual person. And then that ideal is broken. So it has a lot of ramifications for people.
Yeah, especially when this spirituality and your idea of God is involved, that it's not just
Yes.
a physical assault, it's a whole spiritual violation that's happening.
Yes. In fact, I when you say that, it makes me think of there's an organization called the International Cultic Studies Association, and I'll talk a little bit about the cult part of that. But I've been to their conferences, and a woman gave a presentation on the grief that comes when people leave these communities, and particularly after a sexual assault. What people lose is a great many things. They lose the community that they were living in. Lose friends. Sometimes they lose family. They lose trust. It was very interesting to me, the sense that this is a grieving process that people can go through. That is, it's very difficult from a psychological perspective.
You mentioned your investigative work with the Buddhist community. I also
Yes.
saw that you worked to investigate to uncover the abuse at the Shivananda Vedanta Center,
Yes.
which I found interesting because Swami Shivananda was Swami Satchidananda's guru. So I'm wondering what
Yes.
you can tell us what you found with the Shivananda.
Yes. So I think that in a way, it takes me back to the word cult, which there really isn't a definition of what a cult is. It's more of a series of behaviors that maybe exist on a spectrum. And so what I found after I did the Buddhist investigation, what I thought, which was incorrect, I had several incorrect ideas going into that. But what I thought, what this was like one person, who, like the bad apple theory. But then as I did other investigations, not just Buddhist, but as you mentioned, the Shivananda investigation in Canada, I found that there were similarities, not necessarily in doctrine. So what we're talking about is not that there is a religion which advocates sexual assault. That's not the case. The teachings that all of these groups are teaching have value for people. It is when we see behaviors like an authoritarian, charismatic leader. So, all right, there are a lot of groups that have that. So that's not necessarily indicating that an organization is a cult. And a better way to say it, I think, than cult is a high demand, high control group, because there's no real definition of what a cult is. And it does have a kind of a pejorative meaning or connotation. So if we call it a high demand, high control group, then at the top we have a charismatic authoritarian leader, and that leader cannot be disobeyed. So now we have a little bit of a kind of a problem or a red flag, because it means that one person holds all of the power, and no matter what they do, you have to work in your mind that this is for your benefit and that this person is all knowing, all powerful. And so if it feels like it's wrong, like being sexually assaulted, then there's something wrong with you. Because by default, that has to be the case, right? If the leader is all powerful, all knowing, does all things that are good for all beings, then you really don't have any choice. So that's what I found out in Shivananda, was that I began to see that there was a lot of control put in the hands of people who then had all of the power, and that led to difficulties. And that was an interesting investigation because it was sponsored by a group of people who came together when they left Shivananda. When the first woman posted on Facebook, and I think that this was December of maybe 2019, then a group formed to support her. And then that support enabled other women to come forward. And that group continued a Facebook page. I think it exists today, but it was certainly extremely active in that early part of 2020, I think even through 2021. And so that group had gotten together and they said, we don't know if the organization is going to do anything about this, so we would like you to do an investigation. And we did it in two parts. I handled the sexual assault part of it. And then I worked with Jasna Pankania, who's an Australian woman who has been very involved in uncovering and advocating for survivors of child abuse and adult abuse in spiritual communities. And she did the kind of other kinds of abuse because we may only be talking about sexual abuse, but in fact, high demand, high control groups can create a lot of difficulties for their adherents. Sometimes it's money. So certainly we've all heard of groups that say, you know, you have to give me all your money.
Mm.
And there's no real recourse for that under American law. But in any case, Jasna interviewed people about all different kinds of abuse. And we found basically that when you have, no matter what the spiritual framework is, if you have a high demand, high control group, there can be problems. It's not always the case, but you can see that it's fertile ground for an abuse of power.
Yes, I appreciate that you spoke on the similarities regardless of faith.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you've also noticed any similarities between the survivors that have come forward, respective of their faith or religion.
Yes, absolutely. What an interesting question. Yes, I do think so. I think that, again, from a certain point of view, we can take the content of the teachings out of it. And so, whether we're talking about a Christian, high demand, high control, maybe evangelical, there's a prosperity gospel, you know, there are all kinds of little groups. Sometimes they're faith based, and other times that they're not. But I do see, and I think all of us lawyers who are working on my team see that our survivors have similar kinds of harm, right? So they're all trying to process in their own way what has happened to them, but they have things like complex PTSD. They have lack of trust. They have difficulty with normal kinds of trusting of people that we do in our society, which is very, very sad, in fact. And so, yes, I think that there's a kind of a similarity of the kinds of trauma that people experience when they're harmed in this way, that we see in a lot of our clients. Now, of course, people are individuals and they come into these situations because they've had abuse in their background that they're trying to heal from. So you can imagine that that kind of damage is a kind of a double whammy for them. It's coming in to heal and being harmed at the same time. So everyone is different. They come in differently. They have different responses. But I think there are similarities among survivors who experience this kind of sexual abuse in spiritual communities.
I've listened to a lot of the podcasts that you've been featured on in preparation for this. And in one, you mentioned that survivors often have non-economic demands. What
Yes.
does that mean? And how do you go about getting those demands met?
Yes, yes, indeed. So if I can back up for a
Sure.
second for the benefit of your listeners to say that let's do a little, kind of like a setup of the US justice system in like 25 words or less. I promise you.
Okay.
And so we have criminal and we have civil. And so you can do one or the other depending on what's happened. The criminal justice system is very different than the civil justice system. And the criminal justice system is only about the person who was the perpetrator. And it's only about if you're guilty going to jail. That's the kind of end of the road for the criminal justice system. In the civil justice system, we have the opportunity to sue a perpetrator if we wish, if the client wants, but we also have the opportunity to sue an organization that we feel has enabled this. And so, for many survivors, because you're talking about non-economic factors, it's not the money, because that's the only thing that's at the end of the road, really, in the civil justice system is money. So you go in front of a jury, the jury says, yes, they're guilty, and this is how much money we're going to give you for the harm that you suffered. But most of these cases settle before trial. Some of them do go to trial. And if a case settles before trial, sometimes our clients want what we call non-economic justice or non-economic factors. And those might be, we want you to have a policy that this can't happen again. So a lot of people who do litigation, which by the way is not an easy path, it's not easy to be involved in litigation, particularly if you've had trauma, as all of our clients have had from this kind of thing. So when you're in litigation, there's a complex of reasons that you may be there. Money is the only thing that we can actually get if we do get anything, which we always hope that we do. But the other thing that people want is some sense that I'm doing this for a greater purpose. I'm doing this so that other people will not be harmed in the same way that I've been harmed. And so some of those things that people may ask for, one of our clients wanted the defendants, the organization that had been aware of this and had allowed it to continue, they wanted them to take a class. They wanted the board of directors to take a class on what's called healthy boundaries.
Mhm.
And this was a Buddhist organization. And so that's the kind of thing, or to have a policy, or to put something on their website that says, we've investigated this and the spiritual leader has been fired from our position, from our organization, so that others learn of it and they are not put in the same position as our clients have been. So we do try to get those, understanding that, again, the civil justice system is about money, and sometimes we are able to do it, and sometimes we are not. Sometimes I think that it takes not just the legal process, but also the media process. People who are doing podcasts like you are, Brianna, that educate people about these kinds of situations are terribly important, because there's not just one, kind of silver bullet that is going to change all of this.
You mentioned that there's often people who enable the abuse to occur. What do you see that usually looks like?
It usually looks like, well, it could be a number of things, but let's start with some of the simple things. Really not wanting to know. Like but you don't really want to have it, kind of filter into your brain because let's say that you're involved with a spiritual leader. Let's say you're in a leadership position. Let's say that, as most people are in these communities, you are devoted to your leader and that you have gotten very positive things from being in that community. I think the first thing is that sometimes people have an idea, but they don't really want to let it settle into their brain. That's one level of knowing, but not knowing. Then I think that there are people within organizations who know, but who rationalize it. So I hear lots of rationalizations from groups. I hear things like, well, since this person, this spiritual leader, can do no wrong, then this must be okay. This thing that's happening must be okay. I hear things like, this is being done for teaching some kind of lesson to the person who's being assaulted. It's non-attachment, or it's, some other kind of spiritual theory.
Mhm.
It's often things like, it's really a positive thing for you. And the fact that you don't see it that way is because you're not enlightened enough. So there's a lot of what I would call spiritual bypassing and spiritual rationalization that goes on within communities. So then what we see is that people actually do know what's happening, but they put it into some other context than the this leader is sexually assaulting another person in the community. There's a sense that it must be consensual, which is very hard to be when there's an imbalance of power. And so people either rationalize it or ignore it. But the law doesn't really recognize that. kind of if you knew or should have known, then there can be legal consequences.
That reminded me of some of the responses that I heard to what happened at Yogaville about the women that came forward. At first, a lot of people were denying that it happened at all. And then when that became harder to ignore, that rationalization process started happening. And they were like, oh, well, it wasn't an assault, it was consensual. And it was actually a gift from the guru that all this happened. So it's often it's part of the ideology that allows for these abuses to occur. And once people have bought into that, then it just completely changes the way your brain rationalizes these horrible situations.
Yes, indeed. It's very, very common what you're talking about. I think that I will go back to, for example, the first investigation that I did of the Buddhist community in Canada, and it was very much that way. I now know that there'd been a kind of underlying knowledge, kind of a river, an underground river that kind of carried this information, and people kind of knew about it. But when women came forward, and particularly in this case, one woman came forward and she took on a year-long project on her own. She said, I'm going to spend a year and I am going to try to understand what she called why every one of the kids that were children with me in this organization were sexually assaulted. I'm going to try to look into that. And it was at the end of that year that I became involved with her. But she posted, there's an article in one of the Buddhist magazines about what she was doing, and people were like, no, this is a lie. This is not true. I cannot believe that. It's exactly what you've said. And I understand that. I think that it is very hard for people who are perhaps not close to the center of these things and don't have a daily, interactions to believe that someone is not telling the truth. And so what she'd asked me to do was to investigate it the same way that I would investigate something in a corporate business where someone was accused of some kind of sexual misconduct. They would bring in somebody like me to investigate. And so she asked me if I would do that because our feeling was that maybe if people saw the evidence or if people saw the patterns, then we could get past, we could help the people who were saying, I don't believe this, to see that there was actually corroboration of these things. And so women began to come forward. And as the investigation went along, I think that there were, in this instance, a lot of people who then began to say, well, it's hard to not believe this now, right? But it was hard for people to wrap their minds around it at that time. For people who are in leadership positions, as there was the case in this community in Canada, their whole goal was to protect the leader. That was their, purpose in life. And so there is another rationalization that says, well, but he's done so much good that I don't want these bad things that have happened to interfere with his ability to do more good in the world, which I understand, but which I don't agree with.
Mhm.
Right, because that's why we have laws, because we're not prioritizing some people's good over things that they do that violate the law. That's why we have law, so that we can have some kind of system of saying, well, yeah, you may have done really good things, but you did this bad thing, and now you have to be held accountable. That's the whole purpose of law.
You mentioned the religious fervor that this devotion that people have to
Yes.
theater and they dedicate their entire lives to it. I'm wondering if any members of the organizations you've took on have ever tried to interact with you or harass you or other people in your firm. Is that something that's a risk that happens?
Well, so it's interesting. I think, sometimes we think a little bit about the risks. I've never felt personally threatened. I've been told from time to time that because of a case, not that I was involved in, but that Anne Oliverius was involved in, who's the partner of our firm, that thousands of people were chanting for her death in India. I've been threatened with defamation, that somebody was going to sue me for defamation. which is, by the way, one of the big things that happens in these cases. I've also, I think someone threatened to have my bar license. They were going to make a bar complaint against me, but none of those things have happened. If you think about people who've had an enormous, as you said, a lifetime of devotion to a person, and then they have to try to wrap their minds around some other new reality, that it's going to be very difficult. And what they're going to do is to try to lash out at the people who are trying to make them wrap their minds around a new reality, if that makes any sense. It's like, I'm the person, or my lawyers are the people that are trying to tell you, no, no, this isn't good. This wasn't a good thing that this person did. It's very hard for people who've devoted their lifetime to another narrative to accept a different one. And they do lash out. But honestly, I've never felt in any kind of physical danger. Or I do have to say that when I was threatened with defamation, it scared me.
Hmm.
It did. It scared me. I'm a lawyer and it scared me. So you know that, for ordinary people to be threatened, not that lawyers are not ordinary people, but we know a bit about the law. And so for other people, for survivors, for example, to be threatened, and often that happens, it's not an uncommon thing. Because I don't think it's a conscious strategy in some ways. I think it's an unconscious, this must be not true. I cannot accept that this is true.
Well, I'm glad nothing harmful has come about you as you're doing this work. I'm wondering, how is it possible to sue an organization if the leader is dead? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. It goes back to I don't think it was 25 words or less, Brianna, but my earlier discussion of the civil and the criminal justice systems. So in the civil justice system, it's not just the person who committed the violation of law that you can sue, because there are various laws that might involve an organization. So, for example, there are laws about negligence. So, I think everybody probably can understand that. If you, for example, are in a supermarket, let's say, and there is a big puddle on the floor and it should have been cleaned up, but it wasn't, and it's not visible, and you step on it and you slip up in the air and you hurt your head. It is possible that the store was negligent. And that's the kind of claim that we often bring in these cases. So we have a case in California, for example, where we're saying you allowed an unsafe situation to exist because you knew that this particular person was a sexual predator. So that's a lawsuit against the organization itself, as opposed to the individual. So, where the individual may be alive, we often try to sue that person. Sometimes we can't get service because they're not in this country, for example. Or, as you said, the person may be dead, in which case, obviously, we can't get service. But then we have the ability to say, if these people knew about this, then we're going to say to the court, we believe they were negligent in not doing something about it. So in that case, we have to prove that they knew, or we have to prove that they should have known, that they weren't just willfully ignoring something. So negligence is one of the claims that we can bring, even when the perpetrator is not able to be sued for whatever reason. Another situation is we sometimes bring cases under the Human Trafficking Act, which is a very interesting law that doesn't really have to do in all circumstances with trafficking or the way that we think about trafficking, which is, people being sent over state lines or country lines. In this case, it is possible to sue the perpetrator and the organization. And I'll give your listeners an example of this. If people remember Harvey Weinstein in 2018 and the kind of Me Too movement, Harvey Weinstein was actually sued in the civil justice system under the Human Trafficking Act. And so at that time, I thought, wow, I wonder if I didn't know something about what Harvey Weinstein was up to, because I myself thought that the trafficking meant, like crossing borders. But I read the law and I read the articles about it. And what I found is that the model that Harvey was using, which was to say to young actresses, have sex with me and I'll get you an interview with a producer, that was the kind of thing that if it was done either with coercion or with fraud, and in that Harvey Weinstein's case, it was fraud in that he never intended to do any of this, then that stated a case under the Human Trafficking Act. He was sued under that act, and his production company was sued under the act as a beneficiary of his trafficking. And so that's another example of where you can sue the person who's doing the bad act, and you can sue the organization that is enabling and allowing that person to commit the bad act. Does that make sense?
Yes. I love how you explain things so simply. This is so complicated, but you make it very easy to understand.
Thank you.
Yeah. I've heard you say many times that the law doesn't give us the tools that we
Oh,
need to fight for survivors. What tools do you think that we need?
oh yeah. Honestly, Brianna, I think that I actually say that every day because it is absolutely the case that we don't have the tools. So, what do we need? I think what we need, first of all, is a new approach to what are called statutes of limitations. So, the statutes of limitations are the time period within which a survivor can bring a claim. Now, if we cast our minds back to what we were talking about a bit earlier, to say these spiritual communities and the survivors that come out of them are struggling and highly confused about what happened to them. Was it a good thing? Was this a blessing that the leader gave to me? What happened here? And that struggle can take years to clarify in someone's mind. You don't walk out the door and be rid of the whole dogma of the leadership, of the coercion, of the doctrine that says you must obey this person no matter what. You just don't leave it behind you like you left a pair of shoes. You're carrying it with you, and it takes time. The statutes of limitations don't recognize that. So, some states, every state has a statute of limitations for bringing sexual assault claims, for example, or negligence claims, and they're too short. They don't give survivors the chance that they need to really process this. So, Canada, for example, has no statute of limitations on sexual assault. None. So, if it takes you 25 years to figure out what happened to you, or let's say, as happens with some survivors, you can't afford to have therapy. And so it takes you much longer even to try to work through all of this. Or you put it out of your mind because who wants to be, struggling with this on a daily basis? So all of those things happen, and there's no recognition in US law of this, except some glimmers of hope. So California has opened up their statute of limitations for old claims. And New York has done the same. So, what New York said is basically, we don't care how long ago this happened. If this is a claim that would be viable under a particular criminal statute, then you can bring it during this 1 year. And so there were a lot of people then who maybe they had come to an understanding of what happened to them 15 years ago, but it was long past the statute of limitations and there was nothing that they could do. And so at this moment in time, I think Colorado has done something very similar. California continues to do so. New York had a what they call a revival window for children who were sexually abused, and an adult window. So those are the kinds of things that I think that we need to look at. We need a recognition under the law that the tool that they're giving us, that to get to the courthouse door is a very short statute of limitations. It needs to be longer. The second thing is that I think that we need, and this it doesn't only apply to my work, I think it applies to all sexual abuse work. We need a kind of unified definition of consent because we don't have that. very hard for people who have not been judges, juries, everyone who have not been in high demand, high control organizations to understand that it's not always possible to consent freely. And so a definition that juries could work with on consent, I think would be extremely helpful. We're making progress. We have made progress. So I am old enough, I'm happy to say, to remember when women who were raped by strangers were told that they consented because they were wearing something that was too short or too low cut. And so I think we may be mostly past that, but we haven't come to a true cultural understanding of what an informed consent is. And I think that would be very helpful in many, many cases, just not just my cases.
What's the average statute of limitations for this?
We've seen some movement lately to enlarge the child statute of limitations under the theory that a child under the age of 18 may take time in order to process what happened to them. But what I would say is the fact that you become 18 in one day, or you become 19, or you become 29 does not necessarily change how long it takes to process. So, to answer your question, I don't really know an average, but I would say, for example, there are some states that have 6 years. There are some states that have 2 years.
Wow.
And then it depends on what the claim that we're bringing is. And so, yeah, it's a short period of time. The Human Trafficking Act is a 10-year statute of limitations. And for people, for children, there is no statute of limitations under the Trafficking Act now. But you have to meet the elements of that claim, right? So what we do is somebody comes to us and they say, this happened to me. And then we're, not exactly looking at a checklist, but we have a mental checklist that says, is this going to meet what we have to prove to use this particular law? And so negligence is one, sexual assault is another, Human Trafficking Act is another. There are all kinds of laws, and they can often have different statutes of limitations in different states.
I can't believe 2 years. That's nothing.
It's, yeah, I think that there is at least one state that has a 2-year statute of limitations. Yeah, you can, it's very hard to think about processing something like this in 2 years.
Hmm.
I had a client who actually was raped, and it took her 7 years. It's not unusual. It's not unusual at all.
Especially with cases where spirituality is involved, I can imagine it takes decades because you're unraveling this ideology and your whole conception of the universe and how karma and all these other ideologies that you have to sort through on top of any assault that happened.
Absolutely. It's a whole worldview,
Hmm.
right? We all have a different worldview. We have it from religion, we have it from our families, from culture. And so, yeah, it's really trying to get a grip on a different worldview than the one that you'd been in.
Hmm. There's currently a legal battle that's ongoing between Shanti Norris and Susan Cohen versus Yogaville and Integral Yoga. What does, in general, because we don't want you to speak on the specifics of an ongoing case, what does this process of ongoing litigation look like?
Yeah. So, yes, you're right. I'm not going to speak about an ongoing case, but I can talk about what litigation looks like in general. So, I think of it as a little bit like if you ever watch tennis, it's like watching a ball bounce across into another person's court. And so it starts out with the survivor deciding that they want to bring a claim. And then the lawyers have to look at what kind of claim might they be able to bring, and are they within the statutes of limitations? And so then we draw all of that up, we write up a complaint, and we bounce that across the net, actually through the court system into the court, and that is filed on the public docket. Then we serve it on the other side, which is like saying it's just like serving the tennis ball. It says, here it is. Now it's in your court. They have a number of possibilities. Defendants do. They can counterclaim for other kinds of things that they want to bring, other complaints that they want to bring against the survivors. That's not too common. They can move to dismiss our claim, they can say to the court, yeah, all well and good, but it doesn't really state a claim in the court. So, for example, if we were way outside the statute of limitations and we filed a claim, which we wouldn't do, but if we did, they would say, well, it doesn't matter what happened because the court can't hear this. So that's a motion to dismiss. We would be knocked out, the lawsuit would be over. So defendants in any of these cases have an opportunity to either move to dismiss or to answer. And when they answer, then they tell us their version of the story. So they say, this didn't happen. They go through and they go, kind of like paragraph by paragraph and tell us, this didn't happen. We deny this, whatever. Then we go into another period of the litigation that's called discovery. So discovery is when the complaining party, the survivors and their lawyers, have an opportunity to build their case. So if we don't have a motion to dismiss and we're still going into litigation, we have the opportunity to say, okay, well, now we want to know some things that we don't know that are important for our case. And so we can ask questions, we can take depositions, we can ask for documents if they're important to us. So it's the period of time when we are building our case and defendants, whoever they may be, are building a defense to our case. At the end of that period of time, there's another kind of exit ramp. Another ball gets bounced across the net, and the defendants say, well, you haven't made your case. In all of this discovery that you've done, depositions, interrogatories, documents, you still don't have a case. And then we're going to say, oh, we think we do. We're going to tell the court why. And then the judge is going to decide whether we get to go forward to a jury. So these are all little kind of back and forth movements in civil litigation. And what I should say, Brianna, because I think this is what's always stunning to people, is it takes an amazingly long time. It just takes a really long time. I think no one is prepared for how much time that these lawsuits can drag on for, because I don't even know why, because the courts are probably overworked and overloaded. It takes time to get decisions. It takes time to get people, busy lawyers, focused on taking depositions, etc. But I think that's one of the things that it's often people have an expectation that civil litigation happens like we see it on television. Like Law and Order, where we start with the crime, at 1 minute after the hour, and we've been to trial and we've, gotten either an acquittal or not at 1 minute. Yeah, 45 minutes later, and we must be acclimated to that, but it doesn't happen that quickly. But those are the stages that most every civil litigation goes through.
What's the longest you've seen one of these cases take?
Well, when I was practicing long ago, the law firm that I was with, we had the longest running case in the state's history, I think. And it was like, I don't know, maybe 9 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Now, I think that part of that is because there was no lawyer on the other side. It was a pro se plaintiff, meaning that plaintiff was representing herself. But, it can take a couple of years, depending on how many roadblocks are set up that we kind of have to get over.
Even though Carol wasn't able to get into the specifics of the ongoing Yogaville lawsuit with us today, I still learned a lot. I've left a link in the show notes for you, and this link goes to the website that has all of the information that has been brought forward in this ongoing civil litigation between Shanti Norris, Susan Cohen, and Yogaville/Integral Yoga. There's hundreds of pages of documents, and I have read all of them multiple times. But one thing I found really interesting about what Carol said was when she was describing this game of tennis that both parties play in the court system. She's been doing this for a while. So when she says that something is not common, she doesn't see it often, that makes my ears perk up. She mentioned that once the plaintiff, the complaining party, the survivor in this situation, presents their case to the court, the defendant or the receiving end of that litigation has a few moves that they can do. They can make a motion to dismiss the case. They can tell their side of the story or respond. But she said that they don't often file a complaint against the survivor that is bringing the case forward. But that's exactly what Yogaville did. So if you see in the link that I provided in the show notes, you can look and see that Yogaville, after Susan and Shanti presented their case, Yogaville responded and said, actually, we are going to sue you now for libel, slander, and interference with business relations. Me personally, I think that was a horrible move on their part, and we're going to see how that works out for them. This case has been going on for almost 2 years at this point. It's so slow. I thought it would have been over by now, but it's not. So we got a lot more ground to cover. There's so much more to this story, and we're only on episode 4. If you have any information about Yogaville that you'd like to share with me, send it to survivingsachidinanda@gmail.com. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. This is Brianna Patton. I'll see you next time.